Okay, now that we have this sphere, let's continue and make some more geometry. It's not necessary, you don't have to come up here to, to make anything. So that these two sections up here are called the shelves, okay, or the shelf. And up here there's basically like shortcuts to, so on this side you've got lots of simulation stuff. So here, oceans, we've got collisions, particles, and then on this side we've got everything else basically. So making geometry, modifying geometry. What else do we got? We've got rigging, guides for doing hair. Okay, so these are all shortcuts and really good at the beginning when you're starting to learn Houdini, actually, to just come up here and explore and see what's available, what you can do. But however, typically myself, I just build stuff within here in the network view. So we're going to do that now by making the ground. So I'm going to press Tab on my keyboard. So previously this was made for us, but we can press Tab on your keyboard and this will give you an option to lay down a new node, and these are all the nodes that you can place in this context, in this object context. So this isn't always the same, it depends on the context where you're in. Okay, so within the OBJ context I can place these nodes. Okay, when I go into the SOP context where we can modify the geometry, press Tab and you can see there are lots more here. There are different options. So I'm going to go back out and I need a geometry node. So I press Tab and start typing Geo, and then it gives me this geometry node. Okay, and then I'm going to call this ground. Okay, so this is the same as this node, just that inside here there's a sphere, inside here there's nothing. We can only see that because it's showing me all other objects. Okay, so I can hide that or show the other objects in my scene. So I can hide other objects, and now in here I'm gonna, instead of making a sphere, I'm gonna make a grid, which is a grid just like that. Okay, no, not a grid, excuse me. I'm gonna get rid of that grid. I'm gonna create a box. Oh, beautiful box there. Now within Houdini, it can be a little bit confusing to people because of the terminology and also the use of points and particles and vertices. What's the difference between these all? So in Houdini we've got what we call primitives, which are basically polygons. It's the same thing. So this square face is the primitive or polygon, and then for each primitive we have 4, in this case we got 4 points. Okay, and this point is shared. So for example, this point here, if we come here we can look at the point numbers, and this is point number 7, and this point is shared between these 3 primitives or polygons. Okay, now the difference between the points and the vertices, I think we can view vertices down here. There we go. So you can see there for each primitive, a primitive has its own vertices. Okay, so this primitive has 4, this primitive has 4, and this primitive has 4. So they all have their own vertices. Okay, now so vertices are typically used for textures, for creating UVs and such. Points are used much more commonly within Houdini for creating your geometry, for simulating, playing around with attributes, things like that. Okay, I'm going to get rid of that, and we can look at the information on these different components in the geometry spreadsheet up here, which is somewhere you will be spending a lot of time. So up here we've got a few different tabs. We got compositing here, which is where you'll be in your compositing view. I typically use Nuke, so I don't use that much. Got motion effects, render view, but now we won't be using this as we'll be using the new renderer. Animation for your animation curves, but typically you'll be using your scene view and geometry spreadsheet quite a lot. Now right now you can see this has left us in the channels, the shop, sorry, context. You can see motion effects, so we need to leave that, go back to OBJ. So if you get lost, typically you need to come here, go back to OBJ, and you're in your home, really is where you should be spending most of your time. Now if I dive inside my ground here, we can see information. So you can see we've got points, vertices, primitives, and detail. So these are all 4 different types of information. On my points, we've got the P attribute, which is my position, and this is 0.0, and the position of that is minus 0.5 in X, Y, and Z. Okay, so we can look at that. We go to here, find 0.0, and you can see it's below the ground plane. 0.5 because our box is 1 in all dimensions, and it's in the center. You can see that -1, so it's 0.5, -1 there, 0.5, and -1, and it's below the ground, so it's 0.5. So that makes sense, right? It's in the correct place where that it says here. And if I make any changes here, so if I change the scale, you can see all of these change. Okay. On our primitives, we don't have any information yet, but I could, for example, give it some color. If I press tab again, okay, and then just start typing color, it'll bring up a color node for me. And then we can either apply colors to the points. Okay, we can make this red. We'll take a look in a minute. So we can, now you can see we've got the position information and also the color information, which is another vector, which means we have 3 separate values, separate float values in this case, or we can put that onto our primitives. Okay, and if we come out here, we can see the result is the same initially, right? On the points or on the primitives, it looks the same. However, the information on the geometry changes. Okay, now let's get rid of that because I don't want it. So what do we want to do with this? I want to make a ground, or kind of like a background. So I'm going to delete a couple of the faces. So I'm going to delete, if I get rid of that, let's say this one and this one. And so here I just click and then shift click, press delete. Okay, and I want to keep, so that's dropped a blast node for me. I press delete with my cursor in here, by the way, that's important. So if I make a selection here and then shift click here and then come out with my cursor in the network view, press delete, it doesn't do anything. You can see it's, well, deleted all of my nodes. I'm going to press Control Z and do that again. So select this face and this face, press delete, and there we go. That's dropped a node for me. Now I'd like to actually keep those primitives that I deleted. So I'm going to change this to delete non-selected, and that will isolate the 2 primitives that I selected there. Now, one thing I've forgotten to do, we need to go back up here. This is kind of an important point with Houdini, is that it's procedural. So now that I've made this change here, I can actually go back up to my original box and make a change, and that will, you know, we've only got 2 nodes here, but you know, this is indefinite. I can make loads and loads of changes, modeling changes, and I can always go back to my beginning and make a change, and that will filter through to the end. Now I want this to be on the ground. So one way that we can do that is change the center. If we put that, if we come up here, middle mouse button, you get this kind of handy kind of ladder thing where you can add different amounts of values up here really quickly and easily. So if I set this to 0.5, so it's just middle mouse button there, that will put it on the floor. But if I make, you know, if I change the, not the scale, the size here, then it's not on the floor anymore. And it's always nice when possible to work procedurally, so that if I change the size, it's always on the floor. And one way to do that, that's really easy. If I set this back to what it was, if I right mouse button click here and then go to copy parameter, come to the one below, right click again, and then paste relative reference. So we'll drop an expression which you don't need to remember, it's not important, but what that does is looks up the size in Y from this node. Okay, we can see if I click here on center, it will give me the results of that. So whenever I change this, this will change. So if I change this to 2, it will copy that result and put it in there and give me a value of 2. Now I can take this expression and make changes to it. So if I multiply that by 0.5, it gives me, always gives me half of whatever I put in here, which will effectively keep my box on the ground. So I can set this to 1. Come back here, and then we've still got our 2 primitives on the ground. You can see this is kind of half. There's a blue coloration there and white on the other side. That's because our normals, our primitive normals, are facing in this direction. I think we can view them there. You can see that's pointing out that way. So if I drop a reverse down here, you can see that points our normals inwards, which is what we want. So this will be our kind of stage, right? Now, I'd like a nice curve here, so I'm going to drop so again, remember always tab or right click, and then just start typing whatever you want to do. I want to bevel, so I'm going to drop a bevel. And you can see there, the name of this node is polybevel, but all I have to do is type bevel, which is quite handy. Okay, connect that up. So normally you'd need to specify what you want to bevel, but since I've only got one edge connecting 2 primitives, I don't need to do that. So let's give it a distance. You can see that start to work there. I'm going to give it a large distance, 10, because we're going to be scaling this up. So if we come back up here to the box and the size, I'm going to change this to be very big, 50 by 50 by 50. Okay, spacebar and F on your keyboard. If you're, lost or zoomed in like this, if you press spacebar and F, that will zoom out or kind of frame your geometry. You can also press spacebar and H, which will home. I think that's when you've got multiple different parts of geometry that will encompass everything. Spacebar and F will encompass whatever you've got selected. So yeah, 50 on our box to make it nice and big, and then polybevel will be 10, and let's give it some divisions, 10, so it's nice and round. Let's turn off these, we don't need them, and that's pretty much it. Now whenever you finish your list of nodes like this, it's common to drop a null. Now null does nothing, okay? It doesn't change any of the geometry in any way. You can see we don't really have any information, any options to do anything here. I never use these. This is only for reference purposes, okay? So the very common practice is to type out on this. Now when we need to retrieve the information from this network, we look for out, and then I know that out is at the end. If I didn't have that and I was looking for, getting the information from here, I'm not going to remember the last thing I did was a polybevel. I could have done that before the reverse, for example, and then I would be getting this information, which is not correct. I want the last thing, which is null at the end. This will make sense a little later when we come to lighting and rendering. Okay, so that's our ground pretty much ready to go, and then you can see our sphere there, which we will work on next.